100 years ere seed sown. Truth was twisted, its seeds were grown. Break the lies, spark the mission. Welcome to Quranic Inquisition.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Peace of the Lord to all of you. Shabbat Shalom. Assalamu alaikum. Namaste. Welcome to the show. Today we're going to be talking about this great debate that happened yesterday between the one and only Jay Smith and the one and only Raymond Ibrahim, and moderated by the legendary Hatun Tash. So the debate was very long, and it was actually very nice to see that they got along. In the previous conversations that they had, or the videos, it suggested that maybe it was not going to be very, very friendly, but it was. So that was very, very nice to see. And hopefully they will have other debates soon. I wanted to address the fact that the thumbnail that we actually used, which is this one on screen, was because Raymond Ibrahim had said when he accepted the debate that he was going to actually take the side of Islam and actually try to prove that you can actually make a very good argument for the standard Islamic narrative, even though he doesn't believe in it. But that's what he said. So we thought that that was going to be the approach. Jay trying to prove that this standard Islamic narrative cannot be proven, and Raymond Ibrahim that it would. But in the end, they ended up just talking about Mohammed pretty much exclusively. So that's a little bit of the difference there. But yeah, this thumbnail was just fun. So let's actually start discussing this with us, as always, Kash. Hello, Kash. How are you doing?
Hello, unfortunately, I'm going to be here only for around 30 minutes, but I am excited to talk about this material. It was an interesting debate to listen to yesterday, and should be fun.
Well, let's see what they had to say on their opening statements, and we will focus only on the big things that they were talking about. So let's actually play sections of what they said, and then we will stop and review, give our opinion, and critique a little bit, but from a position of love and appreciation for these two gentlemen. So let's this be seen as constructive criticism only. So let's see.
Now,
Well,
you
all
want
right,
to keep
I
it
hope
to
that
the
works.
opening statements. But in order to
So first of all, so we have there obviously the stream from last night. Here you have the directions to the channels, although anybody here will probably know all three of them very well. And also the links are in the descriptions to the full debates and so on. If you haven't watched the debate, make sure that you do that, because it was a really great thing. So let's actually start getting some bits and pieces of what they have said, and we're going to start to talk about that.
find the Muhammad of Islam, that's why this debate, that's why we've named it this title. Did the Muhammad of Islam exist? Not any Muhammad, not anybody named Muhammad or somebody named Muhammad or anybody in the 7th century. Did the Muhammad of Islam, who was born in Mecca in 570, who lived in Mecca for 52 years, who then moved to Medina between from 622 to 632 for the last 10 years of his life, and during that period from 610 to 632 received a book called the Quran, and it's not just bits and pieces, it has to be all 114 surahs. All of these, this man who lived in that place receiving that book all before 632, did that Muhammad exist? That's the Muhammad I'm looking for, and that's the Muhammad I'm confronting. No other Muhammads. And in the rebuttal, I'll show you some of the real problems that you are having with, because you really haven't looked at the original text of most of those references that you're using. And we've gone through all 30, and you've got to go back to the original text. But that's for the rebuttal. I'll come back to that later. Now, here's your problem, Raymond. You're going to have to prove to me that that Muhammad existed. And also, I know there are a lot of Muslims who are watching this debate right now. And you're going to have to prove to them, you're going to have to defend for them that Muhammad. They're not going to accept somebody who came with a sword, who was happened to be way up in the north, who did all these terrible ravaging things all across Jordan and Syria and Iraq. They're not going to accept that Muhammad, because that's not the Muhammad of Islam. You've got to defend their Muhammad. That's your job. And you have the much harder task, Raymond, because that's the Muhammad we're asking. That's what everybody wants to know. Did that Muhammad exist? Not just somebody who may even someone who was called Muhammad, because that's really what it is in Arabic in the 7th century. But did that Muhammad who fulfilled those 4 criteria, lived in Mecca, received the Quran, and also all 114 surahs, and was named Muhammad, and did all of this before 632 AD. Now, when you look at all these references that you have come up with, yes, there's myriads of them. But the problem is what you're doing, and this is what I see everybody doing. This is what Robert Hoyland did with this book here. This is a great book. This is probably the classic one, Seeing Islam as Others Saw It. And what you have done, and what many people are doing, is that you're taking a view of Muhammad and imposing it on the texts. Many of the texts that Robert Hoyland refers to, that all of the people that you're going to come up with, the 30 plus people that you're going to come up with, in almost every case, you're taking what they're saying, or what Wikipedia is saying, or what people in.
Okay, so that was actually a big important part of his opening statement. Kash, do you have any comments about what Jay Smith has said right there?
Absolutely, and he's framing it very well here, because like he's emphasizing, there's all these sources that talk about a Muhammad or the Tayyid Muhammad and all these different things. So the Mimha Mimdal is all over the sources. And what Jay Smith is pointing out is that when it comes to certain sources, I'll say Sebios as an example, but many others, what we have currently is essentially the framework where the way we interpret and understand these sources, like for example, Sebios talking about a man popping up or showing up amidst amidst the sons of Ishmael and preaching the coming of Messiah, right? So this is clearly not the Muhammad of Islam. It's a big problem. So what we can do essentially is say, okay, well, maybe Sebios lied, and you can hand wave that and say, okay, whatever, forget about the whole Messiah part. We still have Muhammad, but that's an anachronism. You have to be very diligent and stringent about your criteria when it comes to establishing the authenticity and the historicity of this Muhammad character. He needs to, like Jay Smith said, he needs to have the right time frame, he needs to have the right geography, and he needs to have been this person who put together this textual tradition. And just pointing at sources in history that have Mimha Mimdal in it, especially given how Mimha Mimdal was a very important title, but not this man from the Hijaz, basically. So there's this myth that has taken up the framing of this whole entire discussion, which is established by the Muslim, let's call them academia and scholarship, that hasn't properly been questioned by a critical eye. So a lot of these sources are simply just taken for granted that somehow it's related to this Muhammad of the Hijaz. But that needs to actually be established by Raymond. What do you think, JC?
Yeah, I agree with that. What I would add is that what Jay Smith is saying is we have this understanding of who Muhammad is because we have read the Sunnah, the Sirah, all of those things. So when we see now a reference over there in the 7th century, we say, okay, that's the guy. And then we fill in the gaps. And that is a big no-no. We should actually say, yeah, there are references of Mahmeds or Mohammeds here and there in all different places. But we need to make sure that the one that we're looking for is the right one. And actually, Kash and I were taking that basically to the extreme. We are not only just looking at the accounts from Sebios and these people and say, hey, is this the right guy? Or is this talking about a different Muhammad and things have gotten confused? We're actually going to the Quran and saying, hang on a minute, are there stories of that Muhammad here in the Quran? And anybody who has watched any of our videos before, they will know that the answer is solidly no. The stories tell something else, and normally it's all about the Jesus, the Spirit, and so on. So that's actually what I would say about what he said so far. Should we carry on, Kash?
I'd like to add a little something, because what you said was brilliant, actually. I wanted to say something similar. When it comes to all these sources, like these really early sources of Muhammad, right? The earliest source of Muhammad technically would be the Quran. So instead of going to all these other sources that talk about Mahmeds in Syria, here, there, up north, all this kind of stuff, instead, what we should really be doing is looking at the Quran. Because the Mim Ha Mim Dal occurs there 4 times, which isn't a lot, frankly, but at least we have those 4 instances. So we can look at the text and determine, is this text talking about this Muhammad of the Hijaz? We have the source, we have the earliest, let's say, document, the earliest source of this whole saga. So we can just look at the Quranic text itself. And unfortunately, Mr. Hijazi man is not in it.
Yeah, certainly not. So far, we're still on the lookout for his stories. Okay, let's see what else Jay Smith has in store for us. If it works, why is this thing not playing?
It's Dr. Jamal Badawi. Not on this subject, fortunately. It was on the Quran itself. But see, that's why most of us as historians, and you're a good historian, that's why I love, because your material, it's amazing what you do on the internet. And you do an awful lot of great expose on what is happening historically, what has happened historically. I only find a problem with your origins historical problem, difficult exposition. That's the only problem I have a problem with you on. But in every time, you always go back to the text of that century. You always go back to the time period of that century, and you quote people from that century. You're trying to do that here now. The difficulty is you're not really going to the original text, and that's what you need to do. And I'll show you some examples of that in my rebuttal time. Now, until you can prove to me, and until you can prove to the Muslims who are watching here, that you can come up with that Muhammad, the Muhammad who received the Quran, lived for at least 52 years in this place called Mecca. And Mecca really, it is what it's really coming down to. It always starts with Mecca. And the reason why Mecca is so important is because if you find a Muhammad anywhere else but not Mecca, it's not the Muhammad of Islam. If you find any other book that even refers to itself as the Quran, if it doesn't come from Mecca or Medina, it's not the Quran of Islam. You've got to start with Mecca. And I don't think you have really looked strong at Mecca. When you look at Mecca, you're going to have to say that this place just has no historical support for it at all. Not until 741. 741, that's the first time we even see it referred to any document. The Apocalypse of Pseudo Methodius Arabica, which is ironically is the one that was really introduced by Patricia Corona in Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam in 1987. And that reference that she found in the Pseudo Methodius is actually places that Mecca way up in southern Turkey. It's even in the wrong place. We don't see it on any map until the 9th century. I'm sorry, the 10th century, until 900s. There is no reference to it by anybody prior to the 7th century. And Patricia.
Okay, well, that was very interesting. He has actually mentioned stuff like if there is another book that mentions itself as the Quran, is it in that region? What is going on? And also about Mecca itself. So that's a very, very interesting statement to make. And I think, Kash, you probably have quite a few things to say about it.
Yeah, we'll start with, because you were highlighting the 2 words, Mecca and Quran. So we'll break down first the word Quran itself. There's a real problem with the word Quran. It has 2 aspects to it. One, this is in line with what Jay Smith was putting forward. There's not actually evidence, let's say contemporary historical evidence, for the existence of a text called Quran until the 9th century, mid of the 9th century. This is attested then first by Al-Kindi and then by Nicetas of Byzantium firmly in 860. The document is dated, so we can firmly place it in 860. So that's the first problem. Historically, we simply don't have evidence that anyone knew of a text by the name Quran until 860. This is well into the Islamic period, right? We're now already in the Abbasids. So that's the first problem, the historical issue. And the second problem, and probably more crucially, is that the orthography of the Uthmanic Rasim, what that means is the original script form, without diacritics and without vowelization. This orthographic skeletal form does not allow for the reading of the word Quran. What do I mean by that? The word Quran is originally orthographically written with the consonants QRN. QRN, only QRN. Then in manuscripts you start seeing the insertion of an aleph initially. This aleph is inserted between the R and the N, and because R's don't connect to whatever comes after it, therefore there's a gap between the R and N, and therefore an insertion of an aleph is so obvious when you look at the manuscripts. It's done again and again and again. And then it's culminated in the 9th century through the introduction of the Hamza character. Well, people say, Hamza starts to get introduced in the 8th century, but most properly it's fully, say, instituted in the 9th century. And that corresponds then, interestingly, to the first historical attestation of the term as the self-referential title of a book. Okay, why does that matter? Because the Quranic text, again and again and again, talks about the nazal, which is an Ethiopic root, interestingly, which is it has this idea of rainfall. So this is the word that the Quran uses for dissension, right? So the Quran speaks of the dissension of the QRN, right? And we read that nowadays because we're reading basically an edited version of the Uthmanic Rasim with diacritics, with Hamzas, with all this kind of stuff added into it, right? Only then can you start reading those instances in the text as the dissension of a Quran. The Hamza is necessary. Otherwise, all you have is the root QRN. What is QRN? QRN is horn. QRN is trumpet. QRN is vessel, anointing vessel. QRN is emanating light from light. Light from light, true God from true God. Nicaean language, right? The QRN is Messiah or the Holy Spirit. It's the emanations from God. So it could apply to both instances. But point being is, therefore, the text was originally talking about divine revelation and the descension of the Messiah and the descension of the Holy Spirit, this kind of language. And then you add the Hamza in. It's very pesky work here. You add the Hamza in and you substitute the root. What do I mean by that? If you have QRN and you put the aleph and then a Hamza on top of that, it becomes a Hamza bearer, so-called, then you have replaced the root. The root is no longer QRN. The root is now QR Hamza. And the N has been demoted to a mere suffix, which nominalizes the QR Hamza root and becomes recitation. And only then, can it even be feasible for this text to be known as Quran. Hence why it's only ever known as Quran in the 9th century. Implication? The text didn't itself refer to itself as a revelation initially. It became a self-referential claim of revelation with the introduction of the Hamzas and a little bit of other funny business. So, point being, Quran wasn't the name of the book initially. John of Damascus talks about this book in the 730-ish. Then we also, around the same time period, we have Leo III calling it Purkan, not Quran. And then 100 years later, we get the first witness, like I said, of Kili and Nisitas of Byzantium. So, that's the issue with the word Quran. The issue is that word never existed in the original text. That is a innovation, bid'ah.
Yeah, the thumbnail that is here on the screen, this is from the show where we actually explained all of that, and it was a 4-hour live stream. So Kash will prepare something shorter, hopefully soon, where it will be just the basic information about it, but it will be clear to people, maybe half an hour, just actually showing exactly what he has said and showing all of that information. So when J. Smith is saying, well, there is no Muhammad in the 7th century, and he's like, yes, that's right, but there's also no Quran. It's actually not attested until much later, and happy to be corrected if anybody finds that, but based on everything that we have researched, it doesn't look like that's the case. So that is one of the problems that J. Smith actually mentioned, which is a Quran. A Quran was actually revealed to this guy, and it has to be from the Hijaz and so on. And we already have a massive problem with these ones. It looks like all of the focus goes on Muhammad, and not enough focus goes on the actual Quran. And then there is a little bit more, right?
Yeah, so this is going to be something that I won't go too much in detail on. I'll give a little bit of a baseline, but you'll all be very excited to know that on Monday we will do a full breakdown of every detail of this argument. So here's the problem with Mecca. It isn't in the book. That's the problem with Mecca. Okay? Mecca is even worse. It's 25% as good as Muhammad. Muhammad is 4 times in the Quran, Mecca only once. No, I'm not joking. Only once. They say, oh, there's another instance, this word. That's just them grouping up 2 words they don't know what they mean into one, Mecca. That's the other word, Bakka. So they say Bakka and Mecca. That's both referring to Mecca. It isn't. Lies. So the problem with Mecca is the one verse it appears in, which is Surah 48, Ayah 24. In this verse, when you read it as a Syro-Aramaic text, shout out to Günther Lülling and Christoph Luxemburg for setting the giants on which shoulders we're standing. And we're going to go through the entire verse on Monday. To keep it short, Mecca is actually Jesus. Shocker, shocker. It's so hilarious. Every time we investigate something, it turns out it's either Jesus, Mary, or the Holy Spirit usually. Something like that. So basically, Mecca, it's written MK Marbuta H. MKH. The Marbuta is never part of the root. Hence, the Marbuta is in this case a suffix. And if you have only 3 characters, it doesn't have to be complicated. We'll go into the details on Monday. But the point being is the word before Mecca is Bi Teth Nun. Bi Teth Nun means get pregnant or conceive. And then the word after, Makkah, is the root MK Aleph, or just MK from the Hebrew. And this word means lowliness or humility. So the actual phrase itself is not in the valley of Mecca, which is how the Sin translates it, in the one instance where it supposedly occurs in the text. But no, it means by conceiving his humility. That sounds incarnational to me. Shocker, shocker. The book is Christian once again. It's a real shame how it's almost too much, But we'll leave it there. So the point being is that the Mecca itself, that is supposedly the city, right? It only occurs once in the supposed, in this textual tradition, and the one time it occurs, it's so clearly talking about the incarnation. But I'll leave that there for now. And on Monday, we will go through the entire argument in detail.
Yeah, yes, like actually Jay Smith said in the debate, he said the first time that somebody actually mentioned Mecca was in the year, I think he said 741. And that's interesting for so many reasons. Lots of things happen in the 50 years up to that point, Masjid al-Haram, Al-Aqsa, and so on. So we know they are starting to create things. And even the original city that they called Mecca is supposed to be in a completely different region. But this is the thing, it appears only once in the Quran. And because we are all obsessed with the standard Islamic narrative, we think Mecca, okay, so this is Hijaz. So what was going on? The city couldn't be there. And it's like, yes, the next logical step to take is, does it actually even say Mecca? Because it doesn't seem to be a city where everything started. If the city was really big, like, Baghdad or something, it's like, okay, everything happened there, but not in Mecca. We know that it was tiny. Therefore, the really first step should be, what does it actually say? And it turns out it's not a city. But because we're obsessed with the standard Islamic narrative, we start looking at the real world and saying, okay, a city called Mecca, where was it? Because it cannot be in the Hijaz. Could it be up there? Could it be up there? When the obvious answer should be, well, maybe it was not in the Quran to begin with. And the more we understand the Quran, the more we unpick those words. Another one is like Badr, but we will get there at some point. And like Kash said, so we're going to do the full explanation on Monday. We will also show some of the sections that J. Smith and Raymond Ibrahim discussed when they are actually talking about Makkah. And it's going to become very clear how they explain that everybody is just trying to find the city, and there are so many theories, and it doesn't appear until much later. And it's like, yeah, that's because it wasn't in the book until they start to create the narrative. Makkah is a creation of the standard Islamic narrative, not of the book. So make sure that you actually tune in on Monday for that one, because it's going to be a phenomenal explanation, and it's going to solve lots of problems with the historical approach, with the Quran, with the Hadiths, with absolutely everything. So,
JC, before we continue, I just want to make a quick comment. This is the crucial issue, everyone. This is the crucial issue. We have the textual material. We have the Quranic manuscripts. We have digital resources to parse through manuscripts like a beast, and I do this on a daily basis, okay? We have it all. We have it, okay? So we have to finally realize that we no longer should trust what the Muslims are telling us is in their book. which is sort of like, no, you should trust them. It's their book. They should, what they say the book says, that kind of goes, right? But they're lying. They don't know how to read the book. They don't know how to read the book. This is the fundamental realization everyone needs to understand. We don't understand this because with the biblical tradition, we have also, we translate in every language. In their tradition, no, very quickly. You can't translate anything out of Arabic because blah, blah. Point being, stop trusting their academia. Stop trusting their Dawagandists. They all don't know what the text says. They are all lying.
Okay, let's carry on and see what else Jay Smith has for. Let's see if it works.
Because of what she did and because of
Nearly there.
everything else comes out of whack. But more than that, she also confronted the whole tradition surrounding how Islam began. In other words, the story behind how Islam began. And to understand the story, you need to go to the sources for the story. So everything you're going to talk about this Muhammad, everything you're going to refer to him, everything you know about this Muhammad, and I would say that's the case for all. There's over 1,000 people who are watching us right now on our two channels. I just checked it before I came on. For all of you who are watching right now, that Muhammad that you're talking about comes from a certain source or a number of sources, and they're from 4 different genres. One is known as the Sirah, which is the biography of Muhammad, so that's pretty important because that says what he does. The other would become from the Hadith, which would be the sayings of Muhammad, and that's pretty prolific because much of the Hadith do refer to an awful lot about what Muhammad did: walk, talk, eat, drink, sleep. And for Muslims who are watching, to know how you're to walk, talk, eat, drink, and sleep, you need to follow the Prophet's example. And then you have 2 other genres. One is called tafsir, which would be the commentaries that help unpack the Quran, because it's so opaque. There's so much, it just doesn't make sense. You need the tafsir, the commentaries. And then the last would be the tahriq, which would be the histories. Now, almost all of what we know about this man and that place and everything that happened on the origins of Islam come from those 4 sources. But those 4 sources, and you have claimed this, Raymond, a number of times, and you've been correct for what you know, and that all of these sources are perfectly legitimate, because though they are not right from the time of Muhammad, they aren't even from the century of Muhammad or the century after Muhammad, they start to appear in the 9th and 10th century, and you've made that very clear. And most people have just.
Okay, so that's very interesting. So Jay Smith says that if you want to know anything about Muhammad, well, you need to look at those 4 sources. And part of the debate that goes back and forth between Raymond and Jay is, well, a lot of it is oral tradition. But if we dismiss that because we don't like it, because it's, oral tradition, that means that most of history we can actually discount, because people would actually tell stories, and often they are written really, really, really late. And he's right about that, except that we are okay with oral tradition. But when you get anything from oral tradition and then you start analyzing it, you need to at least identify whether it is reliable to a degree or if it is unreliable. So, for example, if they're telling all of these stories about Muhammad, we have absolutely no reason to think that it is false, right? This oral tradition, that's what they say. But what happens when we then look at the Quran and we see that there are 4 verses that mention Muhammad, and when we look into them, they are not talking about that Muhammad of the standard Islamic narrative. But for over 1,000 years, people have pointed at those verses and say, this is our guy, this is our guy. Now we analyze that and says, no, that is not your guy. In here it says that he removed people's sins. And in here is actually talking in the past tense, as in he was already long gone by the time that this was written. Okay, what happens when we go to Surah 97, the one about Al-Qadr with the book descending? Well, has nothing to do with the book descending. It's actually a hymn about Jesus. Okay, we look at Surah 17, verse 1, the night journey. We realize it has nothing to do with Muhammad. we get all of this information, and we have an image of what Muslims believe Muhammad to be. And he's like, okay, all of that comes from oral tradition. Great. Then we look at the Quran, moon split, not there, Sharia, not there, and all of these things are just hidden. The stories are very different. They have the Holy Spirit in the book, they have the Shekinah in the book, and they changed all of that. So when those things happen, you realize that they didn't have an oral tradition, because otherwise they would be telling what the book actually says. Now we're unpicking that, and certainly the book says one thing, the oral tradition, or rather the standard Islamic narrative, says something else. And then when you see that nobody discussed with Christians the moon split or things of that importance, you realize the whole thing is made up. Now, nobody would have any problem with oral tradition if you then start investigating and you say, okay, well, it's reasonably okay, but this one from the offset, because it has to be matched with what the Quran says, when you realize that the Quran says something very different, you realize that that oral tradition did not exist. In fact, they created the stories and they just said, well, we always knew it because of oral tradition is a way of deceiving people. The book doesn't talk about those things. Would you agree with that, Kash?
Yeah, it's this very convenient excuse, I would say. It's you know, where is your document manuscript evidence? Where is the historicity of your tradition? Where is this? Where is that? And then the response is simply, you Christians, no one memorizes the Bible, but we Muslims, we all have it memorized. And okay, what? You memorized the text and you guys were all reciting it for hundreds of years. Look, give me a break. I'm sorry, I'm not here to buy a bridge from you, right? So this is the easy, expedient way of basically saying, nuh-uh, we memorized it, nuh-uh. Our tradition from the 1200s says we memorized it, nuh-uh, right? So, and also on the point of oral tradition, you can have an oral tradition, and it's just spouting the lies of a decade before, right? You can have your oral tradition, you can all repeat it to your kids and teach them, but if it's not actually anchored to what the original intent of the Quranic authors was, then we have a disconnect here. It doesn't matter whether you had a lively oral tradition. I'm sure you did. Everyone has an oral tradition. All cultures have an oral tradition. The question is the oral tradition conveying what the text originally even said? And how authentic is that, and how sustained is that through time? We can't test this. We can't know in the 8th century, 9th century, 10th century what they were orally transmitted. We can't check this. So it's an entirely unfalsifiable assertion. And therefore, I don't take it seriously.
Well, oral tradition could be absolutely wonderful, but it really depends, can you trust it or not? And it really depends on everything else that you find. So if the oral tradition is talking about Makkah, and then Makkah is not there, and it's talking about the Quran, and it's not there, and it's talking about miracles hundreds of years later, then you realize that everything was pretty much, there was so many insertions that even if there was part of that oral tradition that was true, it's impossible then to tell them apart because there are so many lies. That's why J. Smith says that much of it was probably done during the Ottomans. So we're not even during the Abbasids, which I'm still like pinning everything to them just to be generous. But it's mostly the Ottomans, and then everything is rewritten back and said all of this was 7th century. It's like, yes, and nobody actually talked about the moon split for 500 years, right? Yes, I'm going to believe that. So there are lots of problems like that. But anyway, when we actually get to talk about the oral tradition and the problems that come from that, we will do that. At the moment, we're just looking at the Quran says, well, the oral tradition says that here is talking about the night journey, but there was no night journey, for instance, showing that all of that was a fabrication. All right, let's see what else Jay has for us. If it works.
If it does, yeah.
Yep.
Walked away from that and said, well, that's not a problem. It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. Because I would throw right back on your lap, Raymond, where is the manuscripts for any of those that you're talking about? You should be more acute to that, because as Christians, we've been asked the same questions for the last 200 years. Where are our original manuscripts from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or for Paul's letters? This is something we've all had to study in the seminary. You've had to study it. I had to study it. And so we're very aware of the need to get into this whole area of looking at exactly what these people said. Because until you have a manuscript, it could be just hearsay. It could be just people assuming that they know what this man said or did. There's no eyewitness account. There is no eyewitness account to this man at all in the 7th century. Notice, you've been very clear that these are nomos. The nomos are only dependent. That's me. I'm a nomo. They are all dependent on sources that are outside of Islam. You made that very clear. Why is there not one source within Islam for this man in that time and in that place? Not one source. Now, you can say, well, because they lost it, maybe they were inept. Hold on a minute. We're talking about only 1,400 years ago. We're talking about a time period where the caliphs were the ones that actually commissioned these men. These men were all in the courts of the caliph. Ibn Hisham, Al-Waqidi, Sahih Buhari, they were all in the caliphal courts. They didn't come from Baghdad, but they were in Baghdad. In the 9th and 10th century, they wrote it down. And when you're at the caliphal courts, you're not dependent on what we were dependent on papyrus. See, all of our Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of our manuscripts were dependent on papyrus. Those are just interlocking leaves that disintegrate within 100 years. That the Muslims cannot excuse. They cannot make that excuse because there is plenty of parchment and vellum in the 9th and 10th century, especially in the caliphal courts, who at that time controlled all the way from Spain, from just below Spain.
Okay, so that was quite interesting. Kash, do you have any comments about that?
JC, you go ahead and take it from here. Just for a second, you start off.
Okay, well, what J. Smith have actually said there is incredibly important. So, for example, with the Christian faith, when people started to ask some 200 years ago, but who is this Jesus? How can you know that these stories actually go all the way back to him, that they were not created, like yesterday afternoon? So they started asking those questions to the Christians, and they just didn't have the answers because they never had to answer those. Lo and behold, they started to look at the manuscripts and develop the techniques to see, okay, where is this coming from? Let's do linguistic analysis and everything else. Much later on, quite recently, we get something like carbon dating. So they do those checks. And they have the reason as to why we don't have anything going back to the very next year after Jesus' death. And it is, well, these people were being prosecuted. They actually had to write things in the cheapest available material. And that's why. Now, that is for people to believe or to not believe in it. You can say, no. There is no excuse. They should have had everything written down and we should have it to this day. Most people will say, hey, they were actually being thrown to the lions. Like, this is actually very well known. They were prosecuted for a really long time, but then they have all of these bits and pieces. They've put them together and they say, yep, they all tell exactly the same story. All of these different languages, they all come from the same original source. And that's why we can actually trust in it. And that is actually without even talking about miracles or anything of the sort. So, and if you don't like those explanations, well, go and speak with West Half or somebody like that. But it will be up to you. Now, when we talk about Islam, it's a completely different ball game. They are not being prosecuted. And by the time that we get to the end of the century, by the time that we get to the mid Umayyads, so Abdul Malik, they already have this huge amount of land, all the way from India to the Iberian Peninsula, from pretty much Turkey to Yemen. It's like these people have money and they need to have those sources because also they have conquered all of these people from all of those languages. Nobody can know how to do anything according to Islam unless somebody tells them. Like, you don't know how you need to groom yourself. You don't know the laws, how many wives you need to have, and all of these things. You don't know what to eat, what not to eat, how to pray, how to do ablution. You don't know anything. They have to tell you, and it's like, really, in an empire that is going to have so many languages, so many people, and everything was oral tradition. It doesn't make any sense. Anything that would tell people how to act would have been written in very, very good, lasting material. And it would have been sent certainly to all of the four corners of the empire, because you will need the people in India to know how to do stuff. And the same with people in the Iberian Peninsula. But we don't have any of those records. I mean, if we had records telling how people need to act and do all of these things from the 7th century, even late 7th century, in Latin, found in Portugal or something like that, you will say, okay, yep, they were actually spreading in that manner. But it looks like they don't have any records for, it's almost like nobody was telling them how they had to behave. The same thing happens with the hadiths. People would obviously be telling stories, but they would be telling stories about warlords and historical figures and religious figures and so on. They would be telling stories, but there is a huge difference between telling stories to actually having to do certain things in a very specific manner in order to get to heaven. Those things would have been written down. They certainly had the money, they had the resources, and there is no way that you would have these hadiths written down even by the time that we get to people like al-Bukhari. And those would not have been mass produced to a degree and then sent to every single corner of the empire. There is absolutely no way, and even translated. So with the story of the Christians, it's like, well, they're prosecuted. And again, you can actually say that is actually not valid for me and is all cope. It's like, fair enough. But with Islam, that cannot be. They are the ones that control the largest empire at the time. They would be writing things down. So, Kash, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting because we have the. I hope there's not loud sounds behind me. I'm walking on the street now. It's very interesting because the Quranic textual tradition is so old, right? So the text is very old. We can date it quite early. However, the interpretations that we find of the text modern day, those not so much, right? The mirage, the night journey, Jabril being the Holy Spirit, all these interpretations of the text, right? We have the text very early, but for some strange reason, these interpretations that Muslims have of the text today, those are attested very, very late. It's this strange history. It's like there's a mystery here. How do we solve it? The text said something very different originally than it says today. Not because they changed the text, but they changed the language. So that's the situation. It's that the text is old, but the interpretation is new. Or not new, as in like yesterday, but newer.
Yeah, very right. And actually, a lot of the stories, we know roughly when they appear, when they start actually having those debates with Christians, and we are talking now 11th century, 12th, 13th. So we know that they keep adding things. Probably every time that they talk with powerful Christians and they make fun of something, then they create basically a new story to solve the previous problem. But in the end, everything has to go back to Mohammed. And actually, I think the next section is going to be interesting because I think Jay Smith is going to pretty much debunk these traditions by quoting some very, very powerful people. So let's listen.
Spain at that time, all the way to India, and from Turkey all the way to Yemen. They were the second biggest superpower of their day. They certainly had access to parchment and vellum. Look at the earliest manuscripts of the Quran that we have. The 6 major manuscripts. The 6 major ones. The Topkapi, the Samarkand, the Ma'il, the Petropolitanus, the Huzani, and the Sana manuscript. Look at those 6 major manuscripts. They're all written on parchment. None of them are written on papyrus. So you can't make that excuse that they just lost them or they just disintegrated. The 5 manuscripts are supposed to be written by Uthman. Where are those 5 that were sent to Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, and 2 were left in Mecca and Medina? Give me one. Show me one. We're only talking about 1,400 years ago. See, as Christians, we know how to answer a question like that because we can go back to the Sinaiticus, the Alexandrinus, the Vaticanus. These are 3 metropolitan codices that are from the 4th and 5th century. That is 200 to 300 years before the 7th century, and they are complete. And they're still there for us to look at. Why can't the Muslims come up with one manuscript of what the prophet said or did? Not just one. It gets even worse. It gets even worse. Maybe you don't know what's happened in the last month. Have you been following what's going on? 2 of the world's leading scholars, Dr. Yasser Qadi and Dr. Shabir Ali, the two world's leading scholars. Dr. Yasser Qadhi, I've tussled with him. We've had debates before. He's called me ultra crepidarian. He did a whole hours a video on me and David Wood and Dr. Dan Brubaker because we're ultra crepidarians, because we didn't realize, we didn't think what we were talking about. And the reason he was so angry with this is because Hatun, sitting right up there, Hatun, you can blame her for everything, because she was the first to actually introduce and show the whole world that there's not one Quran, there's 30 different Qurans. No two are alike. Now, Dr. Yasser Qadhi is probably the world's leading authority, and I say that because he has a foot in both worlds. He is the first to get a degree from Medina University, the foremost university in the Muslim world, on Hadith sciences, on what the Prophet said and what the Prophet did. So he is the first to get the best degree you can get in the world on Hadith sciences. He's also the first in the world to simultaneously, or soon after that, in this century, get a PhD from Yale University in historical criticism. So he covers both camps, the best you can get in Medina and in Yale. You can probably get better than Yale, but that's one of the best you can get in historical criticism. And he was asked just on July 9th, so just a little over a month ago, he was asked this question: what about historical criticism when it comes to the Prophet Muhammad, when it comes to what he said and did? And he had to answer, and this was his answer: no one in the academy, in the Western Academy, affirms the Muslim Sunni science of Hadith. Nobody. It is considered to be completely discredited. So now, put your head around that, Raymond. He said this publicly just a little over a month ago. And then he went on to say,
Oh, well. That is he who shall not be named, Yasser Qadhi himself. Kash, is there anything you would like to say about everyone's
No,
favorite
wait, you're telling me
Muslim
that
scholar?
that Isnad science and Hadith science is not credited? No, you're telling me that hundreds of year old, not old, late attestations and manuscripts like the Hadith and so forth, and all this stuff, right, comes way too late, and they just assert a chain of people who we don't, we only know about these people because they're in the chain, right? So you're telling me this is not science, but they use the word science. Wait, Korea is not democratic? I mean, North Korea, but they have the word democratic in their name. It's like, yeah, just because you call something science doesn't mean it has any shred of evidence to it, right? Or credibility.
Yeah, and of course, everybody or most people have already watched what he said. It really goes out there. And then Jay Smith also mentioned Shabir Ali. Shabir Ali, it looks like one of his jobs is to then jump in straight after Yasser Qadhi makes any public comments, and then he goes in there and tries to fix it. It happened when the holes in the narrative problem actually happened in 2020, and now again with the hadiths. So this to us just doesn't surprise us, just like it doesn't surprise to Christian apologists who have for a really long time been talking about the hadiths and saying, but don't you see that hadiths contradict each other? You have stories you can actually pick and choose anything and its polar opposite, and they contradict the Quran, and it just doesn't make any sense. So it's interesting that Jay Smith mentions to Raymond Ibrahim, like, we have these scholars, these are their scholars, and they have already said, first, there is a problem with the Quran, and second, there is a problem with the hadiths. And if you are a Muslim, certainly a Sunni, you actually have to believe that every single word in there goes all the way to Muhammad. So when you have somebody like Yasser Qadhi saying, well, nobody in academia believes that, it's like, but you are a scholar, you are literally a scholar, you should be able to actually build that bridge. And then he says something like, they cannot be reconciled, the scholarly approach and the science of hadith, but if somebody can, let me know, I want to read the book. And it's like, yes, Yasser Qadhi, you have said plenty, thank you very much. Kash, any other
Yeah,
comments
it's,
on
it's
this?
funny how Yasser Qadhi, yeah, the holes in the narrative and now this, and then it's always sweep up crew. I wonder how long until they turn on him.
Yeah, it happened before and it will happen again. And to me, it looks like Yasser Qadhi is really between two minds. On the one hand, he knows that all of these things are very late, they are fabrications and so on, but also he has to still basically that he's a Muslim, it's all about belief. But I think when he became a scholar, he wanted to become a scholar, he thought they had all of the information, everything was wonderful, and then basically he was slapped in the face by reality. And that's a problem. I really hope that at one point he will just step forward and say, okay, look, I've been doing this my whole life. One thing was belief, but this is just nonsense. Like, these things are certainly not from him. There are other people, and so on and so forth. Because he did say there are holes in the narrative, except that he didn't explain what those holes in the narrative actually are. And Kash, I
Right.
know
So
that you are actually
wait.
pressed
One
with
second,
time,
JC.
so
Well, JC, just 1 second. Essentially, what we have here with Yasser Qadi is this collision, right? Um, this collision between robust academic methodology and tribal loyalties, right? It's very clear that he's also westernized, right? He's got a Western education, and he knows.
yes. And he made it clear again and again. Sorry, your voice has actually gone. I think
And
you
that's
have
when
gone
it gets
now
into the
into the
questions
place.
of, because this is it.
Yeah, sorry, Kash, your voice is breaking up. I guess that you are actually just about to go into an area where you
Yeah,
have no reception. I'll let you
I
just say
will say my
the final
farewell.
things.
Yes.
Yep.
So thank you all for listening to me here. I really enjoyed the stream. I'm gonna head out now, and JC will take care of you for the rest of the stream. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Take care, Kash. I'll speak to you later.
You too. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye. Okay, well, we're going to continue, and the next section is going to be actually about Raymond Ibrahim. People who actually watched the debate, they would have noticed that Raymond Ibrahim actually came first, but we wanted to actually do it in this manner so that Kash could actually talk about the more relevant parts to his research and so on, which is all of the stuff that Jay Smith was actually saying right there. And then we can actually talk a little bit about Raymond Ibrahim, because he actually mentions sources, which we have actually seen on the channel, and there are some of them that are, in fact, like my favorites. So I'm going to give a little bit of background as to what it is that he's actually saying, and some of the dots that he's joining, or when he's saying things like, okay, well, we should really apply exactly the same methodology to Islam as we do to everybody else in history. Because if we do it the other way around, basically everybody in history disappears. Muhammad disappears, sure, but Alexander the Great goes, and Julius Caesar goes, everybody goes. So we need to be consistent. And he's like, no, there is a lot more to that story. Also, he mentions about the Old Testament and says, well, if we apply the same methodology that J. Smith tries with Muhammad about the Old Testament, then it goes. And he's like, yeah, fair enough. Yes, Moses never existed. That's it. Happy. He's like, it doesn't really matter if somebody in history happened to have been fabricated. That is irrelevant to the conversation about Muhammad. I mean, I'm perfectly happy we deal with Muhammad, we find out exactly what happened, and then we all sit down and figure out if the stories about Julius Caesar are right or not. Hmm? The main difference is that if now we find out something different about Julius Caesar, for example, oh, he had more brothers, he was not assassinated, or this or that, it's like nobody cares. Absolutely nobody would care, except for probably 3 nerds at a university somewhere would be very excited about that. But it's not the same with Islam. With Islam, every single Muslim, they actually arrange their whole lives based on words that they have been told. They are traced all the way back to Prophet Muhammad, every single one of them. So, how many husbands a woman can have? How many wives a man? Talak, talak, talak to divorce a woman. Grooming standards, hijab, what to eat, what not to eat. Even Islamic finance to this day is actually based on the teachings from that man. So, there is a bit of a, well, a huge difference between getting something wrong about Julius Caesar and Mohammed. The first one, we actually don't care because it doesn't affect anyone's lives. I haven't met many people who are really trying to reunify Europe into the old Roman Empire. So I don't think that that is a thing. It's not true with Islam. So that's why let's actually have a look at what he says and how he brings forth some of his arguments based on sources, and then we're going to just have a bit of a conversation about those sources. So let's see if we find the starting position. Bear with me just one sec.
just the last month to interpose and is actually historic
I think
in the
nearly there.
7th century. I think 30 minutes. If you can defend that Muhammad, who came from Mecca, received the Quran, 114 surahs, and did so before 632 AD.
Your time is up, sir. Thank you. Your 20 minutes starts now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us, and for Jay participating and Hatun moderating. Okay, the question of Muhammad's existence. 20 minutes is short, so I'm going to jump right into it. I'm going to share with you essentially why I am so compelled that he existed. There's obviously many arguments one can make, and I'm sure they'll arise and counter arguments, and we'll get into it. But for me, the gold standard, the unequivocal reason that Muhammad existed, and not just a figure, but someone who broadly follows the Islamic tradition, is the multiple attestations for him from the 7th century, contemporary, by non-Muslims. Now, why is this important? Historians, when they try to talk about or to determine or ascertain whatever, including, of course, the existence or the nature of religious figure, specifically, they shy away from the writings by that religious figure's community, his disciples, etc. And the logic is they're biased, they're exaggerating, etc., etc. And this, of course, is one of the reasons that the nomos is short for me, for those who do not believe in Muhammad. It's not a derogatory thing. I'm a yesmo. Okay, I like abbreviation. So the nomos, that's what they do, right? They discount essentially the entire standard Islamic narrative because it's biased and they have an agenda, etc., etc. Fair enough. Okay, and that's actually, that's what scholars, the Jesus seminar, etc., that's what they did with Christ. They said, okay, we can't follow the New Testament even though it's very early, so we have to look for what non-believers said. Okay, so for Muhammad, we have a lot, and it's really, really impressive. These are not people who had an agenda. We can't say these are working for an Umayyad or Abbasid, kingdom, and they don't know each other, and they're very some are at the time of Muhammad, some are just a few years later, and at some point I'll get into how important this is, because to those who are not initiated in how history is done, it may seem that 50 years or 100 years is a very long time, but it's actually not in context. Okay, and before I even get into that, I would like to read to you a quote.
Okay, so before we get to the quote that he's going to read, which is from very, very interesting sources, when he said there will be people who just say, well, the sources come from Islamic sources, therefore we will not accept them. And yeah, certainly there are lots of people who will do that and say the hadiths, no, we don't trust them, they are all made up. And it's like, yeah, fair enough, some people will say that. That's actually not what we are doing on the channel. Obviously, we're not talking about hadiths that much, but we look at them sometimes. We've shown the famous one about the cave of Hira and how that hadith, we don't know when it was written, but it says that the truth descended upon this guy, Muhammad, and then it says Waraka saying to this guy, oh, that must be the same angel that appeared to Moses. And he's like, well, that's actually very good information, because these people were Christian. So wherever this story came from, they very clearly were saying that that thing that appeared to their prophet was Jesus. It was the angel of the Lord. So we do actually look at the hadiths and then say, okay, what is this telling us about? Also, when we look at the hadiths, it tells us a story, maybe the story of the poisoning at Khaybar or wherever it is. If Muhammad existed, that story would be true. But if he didn't, then we need to look at those sources and identify if either A, it was a complete fabrication, or B, it was a true story about somebody else. And they simply just copy paste, they changed the name, and they said, this is our guy. So we don't, at least here on the channel, we try not to dismiss sources completely and say, well, because it comes from them. No, quite the opposite. We want to actually try to find out when those sources were written, who actually transmitted them, and in what form, and so on. Hence why we're asking questions such as, when was the first time that someone said, we believe in this guy because he split the moon? And that is a very powerful argument. If you see somebody splitting the moon, you're going to follow him because he has the power, right? So, but when then we see that that doesn't happen until many hundreds of years later, it doesn't make any sense. It makes you question the whole thing, at the very least, a little bit. It is sus. Because anybody who has heard about Moses, they will know parting of the sea. That will be like those two things are hand in hand. Okay, somebody has heard about Jesus, they would have heard either walking on water or crucified and resurrected. These are the main things in the story to make the hero be the hero. It's not because one of these guys was walking around and said something clever. We're not talking about Aristotle or Socrates or something like this. We're talking about people with powers beyond this world. So those are the things people would certainly discuss. When we get to Muhammad, if the story about the moon split was attached to him from day one, that would be very well recorded. That is the first card they would have played every time they talked to Christians. They would have said, ha ha ha, Jesus didn't die. He was not crucified. It was someone else. And by the way, we know that our guy was telling the truth because he split the moon. And he's like, why was that card not played until hundreds of years later? So we do take the sources, but we also question them and say, hang on a minute, does this make sense? And I think, for example, the whole thing with the moon split is an obvious one. That would be the one card they played from day one. That and the night journey. And those things don't happen until much later. And of course, once we actually look at those verses in the Quran, particularly with the night journey, it is a different story. It has nothing to do with him. That tells us those specific hadiths were fabricated. But someone pointed at the Quran and said, you see this verse here? This is our guy. He went to the heavens. See? And he's like, okay, that has nothing to do with him. And so on, as we have actually shown on the channel. But now let's actually go through some of the sources that he's going to mention because they are very important. And for guys, if you have actually seen the debate, then you will know that J. Smith is going to then play another card in a minute, which is, okay, so you are actually quoting those sources, but you are reading stuff into them and you haven't really paid attention as to exactly what they mean. This is something that happens all the time. We already know the story that we've been told a million times. So when we read something that so much as to mention Muhammad, we inserted that one in there and we say, yeah, that's the guy. It's like, no, we're filling in those holes in the narrative. We shouldn't do that. We should just look at the text and say, does it make sense? Is there something missing? And we're going to see that in a minute with one of the comments from Raymond. So let's see what he's got to say.
From Patricia Krona. Many of you, of course, if you know anything about, if you believe in the no-mo doctrine, you know, of course, her immense importance to casting much doubt to the early historiographical tradition of Islam, lots of skepticism, etc. Now, here's what she wrote very recently. No, I mean recently as in later than when she wrote her book, Hagerism. I can pull out the date. I think it's 2000, maybe 10-ish or something. She wrote an article called "What Do We Actually Know About Muhammad?" Okay, and here's a few excerpts I'm going to read to you. She writes, quote, "We probably know more about Muhammad than we do about Jesus, let alone Moses or the Buddha." She writes, there is, quote, "There is no doubt that Muhammad existed. His neighbors in Byzantine Syria got to hear of him within 2 years of his death at the latest. A Greek text written during the Arab invasion of Syria between 632 and 634 mentions that a, quote, false prophet has appeared among the Saracens and dismisses him as an impostor on the ground that prophets do not come with, quote, swords and chariots." Okay, and this is the Doctrina Jacobi. Okay, so that right there is so immensely early, and I know there's an issue. The 2 years, well, it talks about him as if he's alive and he's supposed to be dead. That's actually very easily answered. But let's leave it there. And she goes on to say, quote, if such, Muhammad is the only founder of a world religion who is attested in a contemporary source. But in any case, this source, and she's talking about the Doctrine of Jacobi, which I just summarized, this source gives us pretty irrefutable evidence that he was an historical figure. Moreover, an Armenian document, probably written shortly after 661, identifies him by name and gives a recognizable account of his monotheistic preaching. And I'd like to read to you a quick an excerpt from this. She's talking about the Armenian, I think he's an archbishop, writing around 660s, again, very, very early, and his name is Sibios. And he writes, quote, at that time, a certain man from among those same sons of Ishmael, whose name was Muhammad, and I know there's going to be an issue about the name Muhammad, and I'll respond to that at the time, but for now, let's just go with the actual translation, whose name was Muhammad, a merchant, as if by God's command, appeared to them as a preacher, the path of truth. He taught them to recognize the God of Abraham, especially because he was learned and informed in the history of Moses. Now, because the command had come from on high, they all assembled with their wives and children, and they set out for the land of Palestine, which God had promised, okay, etc. Muhammad legislated for them not to eat carrion, not to drink wine, not to speak falsely, and not to fornicate. Okay? Again, 660s, very, very early, and this was the Thompson.
All right. Well, that was very, very good from Raymond. A couple of things to note here. The first one is he says, well, this is what Patricia Crone said. And he's like, yes, that's absolutely right. That was decades ago. A lot of stuff has happened since. So as well with history or historical accounts of any sort, we know, or historians, they go through whatever records are found, and then they keep digging. There is always more archaeological digs here and there and new discoveries, and they are always willing to change the history. What we call history is just an assumption, the best guess as to what happened based on the documents found up to that point. So the history in the history books that we are learning at the school, or the kids are learning at the school now, is going to be different in 50 years time. Not the whole thing, but in many sections, because new stuff is always found. That's kind of like a very important thing to note. So when Patricia Crone made these comments, it's like, yes, she was at the forefront of all of this research, and what she said was 100% spot on. Now, other things have happened since. One of the assumptions that we're making as well is that because Islam has been around for such a long time, people would have asked questions about its origins, but that is not true. It actually has never happened. We know it has happened with the Christians. Pretty much 200 years ago, people started asking questions. It did not happen with Islam. Now, to a degree, yes, in the 19th century, a few scholars appeared in Europe who started to question the Quran, and linguists who tried to analyze it and trying to make sense of all of that. But there were just a handful of people. This wasn't like a huge enterprise by every single scholar in the world. And this was the 1900s. And then once we got to the 20th century, well, things were kind of odd, because very early on, we had the First World War. At that point, the Ottoman Empire is basically allied with the losing side, and that's when it just dissipated after that. So around the year 1923, I think it was. So before that point, can you imagine if you went to one of the, say, Arab lands or Muslim lands and say, hey, can I actually have a copy of your documents? I want to analyze them. It's like, yeah, you're not coming out of there alive. It's not going to happen. So the research couldn't actually happen in the way that we are doing it now. This is a very modern thing. What happened after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire? Well, the world was recovering from the First World War. Before we realized, we were in the Second World War and then recovering from the Second World War and in the middle of the Cold War. So things were uneasy for a really long time. In the scholars would not have been really jumping into let's figure out this Islam thing. It would not have been in the radar. They would have been going to university, people would have been inclined to go to university to study mathematics, science, to invent things, because the world was at war, or it was, yes, recovering from war, and things were very, very hot, with, lots of nuclear weapons around and things like that. So it's only by the time that we get to the 1960s when the world starts to really calm down. And that's when you see this renewed interest by scholars to look at the origins of Islam. They realized that nobody had done it before. So now and Muslims believe this, they think that everybody has analyzed Islam for the last 1400 years. So they know absolutely everything about it. It's like, no, nobody has looked even for a minute about these things. And there's hyperbole. Of course, some people have done it, but again, very few and far between. There was no the possibility of doing this. The world was not even ready. And even to this day, all of these great scholars, such as Patricia Cron herself, what happened when she came up with her discoveries? Yeah, death threats, and she has to move. What happened with Kunter Lulling? Cancelled. All of these things have been just impossible to be asked, and it is just happening now. So things are moving very, very fast. Patricia Cron, what she said, she was 100% spot on at that point. If she was around still, may she rest in peace, she would have a very different opinion and would obviously know a lot more things, because we are researching and finding more things. It's never been done in human history. We are doing it now. Now, Raymond Ibrahim mentioned, let's have a look at this. The Doctrina Jacobi. The Doctrina Jacobi is such an interesting early source. And for a very good breakdown of this, I would recommend this video that is here on the screen. We did a live stream the other day, basically piggybacking on this idea whether Umar was the Messiah or what was going on with Umar. So if you haven't watched that, you can actually watch it there. It is a speculation, but also just a bit of fun to show how many parallels there are, even in their traditions, between Umar and Muhammad. But in this particular video from the one and only Gabriel Reynolds, they actually start to delve into some of these records. And one of them that they discuss in this video is the Doctrina Jacobi. It is a very interesting one, and it is such a crucial piece of evidence. The problem is what you are reading into it. And I think this is going to show quite clearly the difference between, say, Raymond Ibrahim and then scholars who are really trying to figure out the origins of Islam, somebody that accepts the origins of Islam and somebody who is questioning them. So in here, you see this extract. It is certainly worth a full read. It says, and they were saying that the prophet had appeared, coming with the Saracens. Anybody would assume, okay, so that's Muhammad. Yeah, Saracens, yeah, that's another name for them. That's all good. And that he was proclaiming the advent of the anointed one. And then everybody gets confused, right? Because if you are now trying to shoehorn Muhammad in this story, you will have to say, okay, so that means, yes, Jesus returns on the day of judgment. So he is probably telling his people what to do. But that is actually taking the standard Islamic narrative and imposing it on top of the Doctrina Jacobi. That normally works in history. The problem comes with Islam. As you have seen on the channel, we're actually going through the Quran. And the Quran is not consistent with the standard Islamic narrative. In fact, it just contradicts it entirely. The book is not talking about the stories of Muhammad and conquering an Uhud and Badr and Makkah that we will discuss on Monday. Those things are not there. Those things have been superimposed on the text. So when you realize that, then you have to conclude that when everything was started, it had nothing to do with Islam. It was not somebody saying, okay, I have a new religion. Here you go. This is phenomenal. It is more likely that the person that was around was from a religion that was already in existence. If you read that and you think that the original guy was a Jew, you would think that he's someone who is going to try to conquer Jerusalem, build the third temple, and that will bring the Messiah. And if you think that this original guy was a Christian, you would think he's going to conquer Jerusalem, build the third temple, and then Jesus will return. It's like, right. But instead of that, we really are trying to put this belief of Islam that was created much later and superimpose it on this one document. It's like, this is not talking about any of that. It's saying that someone was around and that he was proclaiming the advent of the Anointed One. But what does that mean exactly? And under normal circumstances, you will take the standard Islamic narrative and you will take that as the interpretation for these lines. And that would normally hold until you start to actually look at all of the other evidence, like we've mentioned before, stories like the moon split and so on appearing much, much later, the Quran saying very different stories, and so on and so forth. That's when you have to consider, no, hang on a minute. So the whole thing has really been fabricated, exaggerated, and really they have done something very, very weird with it. So that's sort of like the difference. This Doctrina Jacobi, Professor Reynolds speaks about that for that specific reason. That sentence in there does not sound like the Muhammad of the standard Islamic narrative. In fact, it actually sounds someone who was either a Jew or a Christian, and the denomination, or whether heretical or not, well, that's open for discussion. We don't have that information. But someone from a religion that was already established and probably wanted to conquer Jerusalem and build the temple. Hence why on our live stream, I said, okay, let me actually just give you all of the information I have about Umar. So it will make you think that maybe he was the original Muhammad. And actually, we will go back to that in a minute. But hopefully that makes sense. The Doctrina Jacobi is a very important document. And if you haven't actually read it, make sure that you do at one point. And we have as well some extracts on the channel. We'll show you that in a minute. Okay, let's see what else Raymond
Translation. Now,
Ibrahim has for us.
just these two, okay, the Doctrina Jacobi and Cebios, not only do they talk and essentially are very early and talk about Muhammad, and one of them names him, but they really conform in the broadest outline to the Islamic tradition, especially Cebios. Cebios says he was a preacher. He says he gave them laws. He says things about banning alcohol. All of this is, of course, consistent with the Muhammad of Islam. And as far as the Doctrina Jacobi, he talks about him as a violent man who's trying to wed violence with preaching the truth of Islam. And of course, in the full text, he says he has the paradise to heaven, etc., etc. And this, of course, is what you would expect non-Muslims to believe about Muslims watching his career, which was one of violence and claiming that God is telling him to do this. But above and beyond these two, there are so many more. Okay, so for example, John of Damascus, who was born around 675, again, very early, and Theodore Abu Qura, they both, again, even more so, name Muhammad explicitly as Muhammad and describe his role as a founder and lawgiver of the Arabs. And they even mention specific doctrines that we do know are part of Islamic teaching, such as the denial of the crucifixion, or Jesus being only a prophet, and that there's a sensual paradise, and all the circumcision, dietary laws. This also comes out. Okay, so the importance of this, just to underscore, these are early multiple various attestations, not from Muslims. We don't have this generally for other historical figures. This is the
All right, and that is my favorite source. He mentions John of Damascus, and this is a very interesting topic. Oh, actually, hang on a minute. Yeah, I should have shown this before. So on the channel, for people who are aware of these sources but you haven't read them, you can actually see I actually AI'd these videos. So John of Damascus, Cebios, the Doctrina Jacobi, just the extract, and also the letters from Leo III and Umar II, which I was surprised that they didn't actually talk about them. I thought they were going to bring them up. But yeah, if you actually like to listen to stuff as opposed to reading stuff, those videos are there, nice voice overs and stuff. So make sure that you check them out so that you are familiar about what or what the fuss is about these very early sources. Now, John of Damascus. This one is really, really cool, and certainly my favorite source. So Raymond Ibrahim, he says, John of Damascus mentions Muhammad. Yes, he's right, except that I think in the Greek is Mahmad, but like he then explains, you shouldn't actually think too much about that. There is a difference between translation and transliteration, so forget it. That's fine. Now, the problem is that John of Damascus doesn't speak about the Muhammad of the standard Islamic narrative. In fact, he doesn't talk about Islam. And what we normally do is we try to shoehorn the standard Islamic narrative onto his words. This is what we just try to do. For example, we see Ishmaelites, Saracens, and Hagarenes, as he calls them. And Raymond Ibrahim will then say as well during the debate that this is what they were calling themselves, or rather Muslims is what they were calling themselves. So everybody else would call them something else. And it's like, well, no, not in this case, not when John of Damascus is the one writing this. If you read what he wrote, you will see that he is actually telling the church what his experiences are with these Ishmaelites. So he's just reporting the whole thing. So why would he actually say the things that he does and then not mention Muslim? He will certainly know that. But even if you say, okay, no, they didn't tell him that they were Muslims. Okay, we have a problem. Actually, a problem is that Muslim doesn't appear until later in inscriptions, although I could argue that there is one from the year 694, I think it is. But never mind that. Patricia Crone says that it's in the early 700s. Now, John of Damascus is reporting to the church. So you are expecting him to write everything the best that he knows. He will talk about the Quran, yet he does not call it Quran. He says, oh, these people worship a book. So fine, you have to say, okay, so they didn't tell him the name of the book, or he forgot about it, or he didn't think it was important enough to report to the church that they followed a book called Quran. He calls it a book. He's like, okay, that's a strike one. Second, he doesn't call them Muslims. He does not mention Islam. It's like, fine, he didn't find that to be of importance, but that's strike two. Then he actually attacks this. He says a false prophet named Muhammad. So he is going on the attack. And if you read or listen to the AI generated reading of this heresy of the Ishmaelites, you will see how he's really attacking these people. He's the first polemicist that we know of. He makes fun of them. He makes fun about how the book they claim that had been revealed. He just keeps attacking them. He keeps saying that the whole thing is nonsense, the whole thing. Now, some arguments that I have heard against John of Damascus writings and why that information is not there is, oh, well, he didn't write about the night journey or about the splitting of the moon, or he didn't really criticize this or that or that. All that is missing is because, well, he was in Damascus. Therefore, he has to be very careful. And it's like, no, that's actually not the case. Because John of Damascus was in Damascus, the story says, until the year 705. At that point, he becomes a monk, and actually he heads over to Jerusalem. When he is doing his writings is later on in life. It's probably around, I think the date that is normally given is about the year 730. He's not there with the Caliph and people around the Caliph just watching over his shoulders as he's writing things. If that were the case, and those people were Muslims, there is no chance that he would write something like false prophet named Muhammad. Not in a million years he would have been able to write that and survive. And when you see everything else that he wrote, the same. The things that he wrote, according to Islam, that would not have gone anywhere. So we know that when he wrote these things, he was free to write anything and everything he wanted to say. And everything that he says happens to be, except for one little item, everything seems to be in the Quran, which is already quite suspicious. But there is more. One of the stories that he says is about the table. He says, oh yes, and these people say that Jesus asked God in the heavens to send down a table, an incorruptible table. He's like, okay, well, we've discussed that one on the channel. That doesn't make any sense. It's the Holy Spirit. When he's there with the Hawariyun, and then the Hawariyun says, oh, can you actually ask your Lord to send us a table? It's not a table. So we know that the Quran was written, obviously, before that point, and they already change the meaning of some stuff from the very first iteration of the book all the way to John of Damascus listening to these stories. But the most important thing about his account is everything that he does not mention. I would actually challenge anyone to do this. Just read his account and then try to understand why would he not write about Muhammad's wives, about the way that he passed away, about his lack of miracles or miracles that people would tell him. Why wouldn't he write about the Ridda wars or the succession wars? Why wouldn't he talk about, well, and I'm here with Abdul Malik and he thinks that he is the rightful ruler based on consensus because of this Muhammad? He does not link this Muhammad he's talking about and the Ishmaelites with Abdul Malik and the Umayyads at all. So it's not just about the things that he said, it's actually the things that he would certainly say, but he didn't. That actually tells us clearly that the story is actually being built. It is also possible that the story was somewhat built, but not in Damascus. That was supposed to be the capital of the caliphate. But maybe Islam was not really being developed in there just yet. It was developed maybe in Iraq, maybe around Petra or wherever it may be. And over there, they would have all of the stories. But by the time that people reach Damascus and they are speaking with him, they will be basically missionaries telling him some of the stories. But think about it. Why wouldn't he actually say, hang on a minute, Moses died of old age after he completed his mission. Jesus died and resurrected, which was his mission, but your guy was poisoned. What is going on? He would have made fun of that. So the fact that he doesn't actually discuss those things, you would have to really maneuver through that and say, okay, well, people would be embarrassed, so they wouldn't tell him, and all of those sort of things. Anyway, John of Damascus is a very important source, and I would say it's my favorite. So at one point, maybe I will do a full video where we'll go through absolutely everything and really just clarify all of the things John of Damascus certainly would have said, and he didn't, which actually gives us an indication of what was happening. The narrative had not been built yet. Let's see what else Raymond Ibrahim has for us.
Point. I think one of the things that makes the arguments against Muhammad seem so valid is most people are under the assumption that most historical figures around that time, well, you know, we have their social security card and their ID and their DNA and their fingerprints. No, this is as good as it gets. Okay, most of the characters from this time and even after Muhammad, and I'll give some examples, they're much worse. You get, and we don't doubt them. We don't say they don't exist. We go with what we have, and that's the end of it. Okay, but why do we doubt Muhammad? And I'll get to that, because there's a reason to doubt Muhammad. There's a reason to doubt Jesus, because they actually matter today, whereas historical figures don't. So everything has been brought up against them, even though without appreciating the fact of how tenuous and fragile history is, and the fact that compared to others, they have so much evidence. Now, the other issue is the Sunni and Shia divide. Now, I find it just completely impossible to get beyond this one, especially. For those who don't know, the Sunni-Shia divide is based on the succession of Muhammad. And you have the one group, the minority, the Shias, who are insisting it has to be the bloodline of Muhammad. And then you have the majority, the Sunnis, who say, okay, just the qualified Quraysh chieftain, etc., etc. Now, if this is, first of all, if this is a conspiracy, okay, how did this happen? What are the origins of this? This would require two different groups, Shias and Sunnis, to be at the same time co-conspirators and at the same time agree to fight and kill each other in perpetuity. Okay. I mean, I'm trying to understand the origins of this, but above and beyond that, at the same time, we again have very early attestations to this, to the Shias and the Sunnis, again, not from Muslim sources, but from Christian sources. Cebios, who I just mentioned from the 660s, talks about early factions and disputes following the life of Muhammad. The Maronite Chronicle, written right around 687, mentions political splits, talks about Muawiyah and how he killed Ali by name. 687, okay? Theophanes the Confessor, writing around 810, mentions Muhammad, of course, as we know, as a false prophet who appointed Abu.
All right. Well, the Sunni and Shia split. Raymond Ibrahim, I think he mentioned that a number of times during the debate, and he said it clearly. He cannot actually get his head around as to how else that could have happened. Well, this is the thing. Something happened, and we don't know what it is. So we go to the Islamic sources, and then we then conclude, okay, that must be the explanation. It's like, well, not necessarily. That is because we don't have any other information. Imagine we now find a piece of parchment that actually explains everything exactly how it happened. That somebody actually said, okay, these people are fighting because of this. It's because we are actually missing that evidence. Now, in the historical approach, is actually quite basic to a degree, because we don't have another piece of information that contradicts this. We take what we've got, and that's fine. 100%, thumbs up. Now, if new information becomes available, then is when you get to understanding what happened. Hence why Kash and I, we're actually focusing on the Quran, because understanding that the Quran didn't talk about Muhammad and all of these stories is really, really important. We know that things then start to be built much later. Now, how can we actually understand the split between, or the fight between Sunnis and Shias, if we think that it's all about a guy called Muhammad who got a book, and that book contains all of his stories? It's like we are never going to get to the bottom of it. But if we understand what the book says, then is when we can say, oh, hang on a minute, there is something else here. Maybe this explains what happened. Quite simple. During one debate of, I think it was the Christian Prince, and he had some Sunnis and Shias on the show, and I found it fascinating because the Shias said to the Sunnis, oh, bro, you worship Umar. And the Sunnis said, oh, bro, you worship Ali. And he's like, well, that's your answer right there. It could be as simple as that. We did have two rulers who are actually attested very thoroughly, or quite thoroughly, in history, in inscriptions, in documents, in all sorts of sources. And those are Umar and Ali. So those are two guys who are there present when they want to start conquering. They actually conquer a lot of land. So it could be as simple as those guys. It has nothing to do with religion, but they were the same clan. They are the same clan. When Umar is actually in control of the whole thing, then everything has to then become, Ali is the one who has to inherit the whole thing when Umar is unalived. But something happens. He gets analyzed by Muawiyah, and now those guys that they have all of the lands, they have to say, hang on a minute, this is our territory now, and we have the right to it, because the system that appoints the rightful ruler of all of these clans, all of these lands, all of these different peoples, is the greatest guy, the most competent guy, and that's going to be the caliph. But then you have other guys who start saying, no, hang on a minute. All of this should have been Ali. He was actually there with Umar fighting left, right, and center. Everything should have gone to him and anybody that comes after him. And that's the divide right there. You have those who, where it's like, if you get conquered, the ruler will be whoever has the most power. And the other ones that says, no, we actually want to be the ones that are linked to Ali. And there is a divide. In the sources, the Shia sources, they actually make Ali and Fatima into divine beings. I think they make them like being created from the spirit and the light. I can't remember if Muhammad is from the light and the spirit, and then Ali and Fatima, they are created only from the spirit, or if they're just the other way around. It's one of the two. But they turn them into the divine beings. They so they have to follow them in that manner. So the reason that we do not understand that split is not because we already have the story, it's because we still have a lot more unpicking to do. We need to actually figure out things. Makkah is a very important one. If we figure out that Makkah is not there, as we will see on Monday, that is there in the Hijaz, and these things didn't happen in the Hijaz, that opens a whole different avenues of inquiry. We have to now look at the north, at the south, at other regions, and see what happened. And now, Sunnis and Shias, the divide, if I were a betting man, which I'm not, I would put money on is just a matter of who has a claim to the throne. Most people would have been at least somewhat familiar with the English stories of William the Conqueror at a time when the British Isles were all to be disputed. There were three contendants to the throne, and they actually fight it out, and then William the Conqueror wins. And he's like, well, Sunni and Shia, anybody? Yeah, you have these people saying, no, all of this is ours, and those guys says, no, it's ours, and they all have the different reasons. When would they start believing that it is to do with a book and an actual prophet and stuff? Well, I think J. Smith gave us the answer during this debate, because he said that Mecca is not attested until the year 741. So you take 741, you add 20 years plus minus, and that's when things would have started. By the time that we get to what we now call Shias, they are the people that would have said, okay, so those guys have actually made their guy divine. So we have to do the same with our guy. That guy was not divine, our guy was divine. And there is quite a lot more to that. I don't want to actually speak too much about the whole Shia and Sunni thing, because that's something for Kash. He has some views. He's seen some of the parallels between how the Shia structure is it happens. I'll just use the keyword, which is Holy Spirit. They believe that their Imam is the 12 Imams, they are infallible. And he's like, all right, so you guys copied this from the Christians. You were saying that the Imam is basically inspired by the Holy Spirit, and therefore they are infallible. So you see that they were actually creating a parallel story. They were actually seeing who could actually make their guy more divine. So, and the stories, yeah, happen quite early, as Raymond Ibrahim pointed out, but we need to actually figure out what the book said and where all of these things were happening in order to really understand how this conflict really started. So let's see. I think we are very close to the end. I think he has only a couple of extra points to make. So let's see the next one.
Abu Bakr after him. And it also talks about the Sunni Shia split and the killing of Ali. Okay, so this is not something that was created later by Ottomans many centuries later and then somehow cast back. That does not make sense. Who would do this? Why would the Fatimids, or I'm sorry, I'll get to the Fatimids, but why would the Sunnis and Shias do all this? To what end? So they can fight each other and kill each other? And they are the Fatimids. So think about them. Now, the Fatimids, that's an empire that arose in North Africa and was mostly centered in Egypt. And it came around in 909, okay? Very early. What was their claim to fame? That we are the descendants of Fatima. Who's Fatima? She's the daughter of Muhammad. And of course, she's married to Ali and their sons, Hassan and Hussein, who are supposed to be the progenitors, and the line of the Shias and the line of Muhammad is supposed to go through that. And so where did this come from? And their own enemies, the Sunnis, the Abbasids, accused them or said, yeah, they admitted it. These are people who claim descent from Fatima. And it's also interesting when I think about it, Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad, if this was all made up, and this reminds me of an actual gospel or Christian apologetic, a lot of Christians will point out, rightfully so, that the testimony of Mary Magdalene and the other women who testified to the risen Christ, it's actually realistic, because why would someone lie that women, why would they cite women as their sources? Because back in those days, patriarchal society, if you're going to lie, you're going to say men saw it, not women. So the reality of it is that women saw it. Why? So why did they go with it? Because it's true. And I think it's the same thing with the Fatima argument. If you're going to make all this up, wouldn't you create descent through a male line, not a daughter, Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad? Again, so if anything, this strengthens the idea. And honestly, this kind of thing, I see parallels with the sort of Christian polemics and apologetics. So I know Jay's going to talk about Mahmat, MHMT, and these are the sorts of arguments, and I'll get to it at the other point. But this reminds me of Muslims claiming the Paraclete is Muhammad. Okay, so there is definitely a little parallel going on with both religions when it comes to the sorts of attacks that are going on. Then there's, of course, I mentioned this before, but the arguments from, that the hadith and the seerah are really not flattering. If I'm going to be some Arab king and I'm going to codify and create some sorts of stories to help create a hagiographical veneer to justify my empire, the hadith and the seerah are just full of really unflattering things. Now, I've heard the excuse for this is that we moderns just don't understand, but everything that's embarrassing in the hadith actually was good, or for the people in the 7th, 8th, 9th century, they thought that was good. Yeah, I beg to differ. Okay, I mean, maybe there's a few things that we can say like that, but there's really troubling things that from the start Muslims have had major issues with. For example, and Christians, of course, caught on to them and used them in their polemics from the very start. Such as Muhammad, seeing Zainab, the wife of his adopted son, Zayd, and all of a sudden he wants her. And then a revelation comes, and all of a sudden he gets her. Or Aisha, his young bride, telling him, it's interesting, all these revelations that just show up and always validate your desires. And then, I've talked about things like Al-Zut, where, Muhammad goes out in the desert, and all of a sudden these tall, naked, dark men, as they're described, start mounting him. Ibn Kathir ends up saying this is a very strange and bizarre hadith. So I don't think you can just say, oh, we just don't get it. This is actually all positive stuff about Muhammad and we don't understand it. There's another one where, there's a dead woman in the grave and he jumps in and lays with her. And the people scream and say, what are you doing, Prophet? And he says, oh, this is to help assuage the comfort or the discomfort of the grave. Now, I'd like to again emphasize why the arguments against Muhammad's existence seem so strong. It's because they're being pulled out of context and you're presented in a vacuum. And most people are under the impression that apparently every historical figure, we just have so much documentation and it's in the day they died. And it's not like that. What I just told you about those 7th century Christian sources, that is really.
Okay, so that was the final bit that we actually had. So let's actually just discuss that one very briefly, and then we will let you all go. So back to these slides. First, let me actually just put this one here because I'm going to address it in a minute. Let's see. So Raymond Ibrahim said about the principle of embarrassment. It's like that is actually a very, very good thing. But the reason that we look at those sources and we say, hang on a minute, they wouldn't write those things unless they were real, which is pretty much the short version of why then they are valid to a degree, is because we have already accepted the standard Islamic narrative. Therefore, we look at the hadiths and say, well, they are written there, so there must be a real guy. We are jumping to conclusions. Because we don't have all of the pieces of the jigsaw, we have to say something like that. they wrote something that is embarrassing, therefore is more likely to be right. And it's like, no, let's have a look. Let's do this sort of things that we're doing on the channel. Let's start with the very, very original source, which is the Quran. Why is it that the Quran has words like Shekinah, we saw that the other day, and they just hide it? Okay, so that's a lie. And baptism, why is baptism in the book and it is actually hidden, and so on? So they had something to begin with, and then they started to make up stories. Once you actually realize that, you're looking at the stories that are really unflattering about Muhammad, and you have to conclude something else. Well, uh, they are there not because of this Muhammad, because they keep pointing at the book saying that he is there, but he isn't. Therefore, what other explanations are available? And there are quite a few. One that I really like, and certainly I cannot evidence, and I actually don't think that is true, but I really like it, is that at one point people need to sit down and write stories down. And those people would have known that they are making up stories. We are seeing those made up stories everywhere, including in the Quran. They are not about Muhammad. Therefore, if oh, sorry, I've just clicked on something I shouldn't. I was trying to click there. Okay, so if those stories in the book, they are not about Muhammad, that means that other people at one point, they need to sit down and actually make up stories, like the night journey, like the moon split. Those things could actually happen through oral tradition. People are, down there um, in the market square, and they're just creating stories. And then at one point, someone, we now call him Al-Bukhari, hears about those stories and he writes them down. It's like, yes, maybe, or maybe some people are being forced to actually sit down and make up stories. If that's the case, then you would understand how they would try to shoehorn everything that is very unflattering. So that is a possible answer. As I said, there is absolutely no evidence, and I don't think there could ever be any evidence. But once you understand that stories were made up, why are those unflattering stories in there? Well, maybe they were actually placed there on purpose. They wanted to tell people, hey, this is not the role model that you should follow. I mean, the Caliph is telling me if I don't write anything down, if I don't come to him with like 30 pages of parchment with stories written down, I am going to stop breathing. Um, that would be like a possible reason. Another one is that those stories were actually real, but they were not about one guy. They were about many different people. And by the time that we get to the guy that has gone down in history as Al-Bukhari to sit down and write stories, somebody tells him, you need to write everything that you possibly can about this. So that guy would have to go out there and speak with everybody, and they would be telling him stories, some of them complete fabrications, things that they heard from their grandma and whatever, and then other stories, maybe from Umar, from Ali, from Marwan the First, from Abdul Malik, great caliphs, great warriors, these sort of things. This Al-Bukhari guy will then have the job to take all of those actual stories that they are being told and write them down and say they are all our guy, because he has to come up with something. And no human can say, okay, let me sit down and just fabricate all of these hadiths. It's just impossible. So the stories need to come from some place. And I think there are quite a few stories that they were borrowed from those people. So the principle of embarrassment is only, or it enhances the belief that Muhammad existed, but that is only if you are very biased, and then you assume, all right, well, he was a horrible human being, so therefore he really existed and he was horrible. There could be other explanations, and those explanations can only be discussed when we understand the Quran better, when we understand what was happening on the ground better, and all of those sort of things. So that's what he said. Another thing that I wanted to address is, for example, Raymond Ibrahim is talking about the story of Muhammad. Basically, where does it come from? So I'll paint a different story. Let's say, for argument's sake, that the guy who started the whole thing was a guy who has gone down in history as an unknown preacher, unnamed preacher. Professor Peter von Sievers actually describes him as such, perhaps in Petra, perhaps in Iraq. And this guy was actually just going around and telling stories. He knows the Abrahamic stories quite well, legends, as the ones that we show here on the channel with Shai and so on. And that guy ends up being very close to Umar, the guy who ends up really doing something huge, which is conquering Jerusalem. So you roll forward 100 years, and what you get is people think that they actually had a prophet. Why? Because this unknown preacher actually was just telling stories, and things have now gotten out of hand. And why a prophet? Well, because they had a great warrior who actually conquered Jerusalem, which was a great, great feat. And if then that happens, 200 years later, Muhammad and Umar, they're two completely different people. And the one that they ended up calling Muhammad, they have created all sorts of stories, many of which we have already debunked, and many of them we're going to debunk in coming videos. So how about that? We have to actually go back to the book and then understand if people were actually being truthful or not. When we see that all of those stories that we've mentioned are not in the book, that means there wasn't a guy preaching a new religion. This was a collection of stories. I mentioned that Shai is actually coming over to the channel and showing us all of these Jewish legends that they are there. John is also coming over to the channel to show us how many verses in the Quran can only be understood if you actually look at them through the lenses of the Bible. And Kash and I were actually digging into the words that have been mistranslated on purpose in order to give a different narrative. So once we realized that, when everything started, there was no concept of Islam, new religion, and so on. That happens later. And it shouldn't surprise anyone when we consider that we have this initial period, we call it the Rashidun period, and there is all of these fights. It actually has even Ali being killed by Muawiyah, and then Muawiyah is in control for, I think, 2 decades, and very soon after we have Abdul Malik as well for 2 decades. They have a lot of opportunity to start creating things, but more importantly, there will be lots of people in their lands, warlords and people who have their own regions who want to acquire more power. They are going to start creating stories, and somehow the story of this great guy appears. But nobody's pushing a religion that early on. Initially, it would have been Jews, Christians, something in the middle, and a lot of different heresies and everything combined. But nobody's actually trying to say, okay, we have a new religion and I believe to be the prophet. It's like, if that were the case, we don't have a single account of that guy. Looking at the Quran, there is no miracles, and they have lied about every single passage in the Quran. If they have lied about that, how can we then look at the hadiths and say, oh no, the hadiths are fine? Of course they are not. And if you don't believe me, ask Yasir Qadi. So, and one final note is this something I mentioned actually very early on during the stream, which is the how history is actually written. I mean, there are maybe people watching, you would have learned when you were a kid, things like people believed that the earth was flat until Christopher Columbus uh, eh, actually said, no, I'm sure he's round and let's actually go around. People thought he was crazy. Maybe you have actually heard that story. I think when I was a kid, that is a story that I was told. That never happened. Everybody knew that the earth was round because even the Greeks had actually calculated the curvature of the earth. So nobody thought that the earth was flat. But a book was written, I think it was in the 17th or 18th centuries, and it caught on. It actually said that people believed the earth was flat, and Christopher Columbus was this kind of genius who thought otherwise, and he was so right. And he's like, none of that happened. So history can change, or rather, our vision of history can change quite rapidly too when we actually find new pieces of evidence. When we see what has happened with Christianity for 200 years, people have asked those questions. But how can you be sure that Jesus actually existed? And it's like, okay, we have to do something about this. How can we possibly prove that? And then they are looking at manuscripts and doing carbon dating and all of those things. And that's fine. And to this day, you would have seen Muslims saying then to Christians, but Jesus was not crucified. He didn't. Yeah, God just took him. He replaced him and then he took him up to the heavens. They would say that. And it's like, fair enough, because of, so why can't we actually say exactly the same thing? Your Muhammad was not poisoned. How about that? You're saying that Jesus was not crucified. We're saying that Mohammed was not poisoned. He died of old age in China after he retired, and he bought a villa. It's like, can we play that game? Well, we actually try to find out the truth by going to the actual documents. And like I said before, most of the history that we know that we've learned at the school is now different. Anyone who is now over the age of probably 50, if you read the history that is being taught at the school, is different to what you were taught. Not the whole thing, of course, but things change. People find new stuff, and then history gets rewritten for obvious reasons. That's just how it is. Now, it is the time that we are doing the same thing with Islam. It's never been done before. And even to this day, people are being very, very careful when doing anything of the sort because, um, because problems. So it is a time to actually ask those questions. We know the history of Islam, right? We call that the standard Islamic narrative. We can investigate it, and certainly we should, we must, and actually we are doing. If anyone listening, if you actually feel that the stories of Alexander the Great are not all right, you are more than welcome to actually do some research yourself. Maybe you can actually rewrite the history of Alexander the Great because you find some stuff. That's absolutely fine. That's actually what history is. Maybe Julius Caesar. Maybe you find more stuff about that guy and you will blow everyone's minds with that information. Do it. That would be great. We should be able to do exactly the same thing with Islam. Let's have a look at the history as it happened. And as people work on hadiths, there are problems there. As I said, you can check with Yasser Qadi if you want. We look at inscriptions, there are problems, coins, problems, the accounts from people around, problems, and Kash and I were trying to focus on the Quran because big problems. And it seems like if everything started with the book, they needed to have a book. We need to understand what it was written to being able to understand the region and all of those things better. So that's pretty much just my final monologue for the day. I think both Jay Smith and Raymond Ibrahim, they're phenomenal, and they're just on two very different worlds. Raymond Ibrahim, he's looking at the sources and says, yes, this is how history is. And Jay Smith is saying, is it though? Are the stories from Islam the ones that we take pretty much as they've told us, and we say, well, it's a false prophet, but yeah, he was there in the Hijaz and all of those things happen? Or is it possible that maybe the whole thing was a much later fabrication? I think it's a very interesting topic, and based on everything that we've seen so far, Kash and I think we can say that we are very much team Nomo and team Jay Smith, and hopefully some piece of information will be revealed, and we will still hear from Raymond Ibrahim at one point in the future to go, wow, okay, yep, the whole thing was fabricated. But maybe we need to do a lot more research before we get there and we actually make him change camps. So this screenshot, this slide here on the screen is just, I wanted to mention, look at some of the things that we have actually shown on the channel. This is just a handful of things. Shekinah is absolutely hidden in there and very obvious. The Holy Spirit, we have a book that talks about the Holy Spirit, and then someone says, no, it's Jibril. Well, of course the hadiths are fabricated. The Quran is saying, it's talking about the Holy Spirit. It doesn't even take a genius. What about the table from the heavens? Well, again, it cannot say that because it is silly. And we went through that as well. We explained the whole thing. And as we find more evidence, we will bring it to your screen. Make sure that you like, subscribe, do all of those wonderful things so that you get notified when we reveal something really amazing. We covered the 4 verses of about Muhammad as well, and how they are mistranslated and so on. Ar-Rahman, one of the important titles of Allah, which is actually even in the Bismillah, how it was a title for Jesus. And then another long stream that we went through all of the other titles and words that appear in the Quran that are very much tied up to Jesus. So we know where the book came from, at least part of it. Part of it was legends and things like that. So this is more than enough information for us to say there is a problem. the level of invention in Islam is greater than anything else we have seen in history. And if other characters in history have been fabricated, well, nobody really cares. But with Islam, we actually all care. But anyway, I think we're going to get to the bottom of it during our lifetimes. Things seems to be snowballing, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the next coming years. Until then, I hope that you have actually enjoyed this review. It's the first time that we've done something like this. If you like it, let us know. Maybe we do something like that when other people do debates. Maybe David Wood and Daniel Hagekach or whatever it is, or we just stick to our topics and we keep just talking about the Quran and what it says, which we're going to do anyway. So I think that's it from me. Sorry, I haven't actually kept an eye on the chat. Lots and lots of messages. I was actually going to do that, but once actually Kash had to go, so I see Kash actually as well on the chat. I just couldn't actually multitask and focus on a couple of things at once. I'm an old dog, so I am very, very bad at it. But anyway, I will actually read everything later. If there is anything that you wanted me to comment on or something that you wanted to bring to my attention, please, if you would be so kind as to just make a comment after the stream and just say, hey, so this is something I wanted to say and it's very important, or I want to know, then please do so. And that's it. Make sure that you guys are all ready for Monday when we're going to talk about Makkah, a very important topic. It's not just about the Quran, but it's about the religion, the theology, and also about the historical approach and everything that was happening there. So that one should be quite impactful. So make sure that you actually tune in or you watch it the moment that you can right after that. But until then, I think that's all from me. Thank you all for actually being here and for engaging with the chat and actually being quite civilized. That's always nice when people are actually being very nice and helping each other as opposed to just throwing insults. That's really good. So thank you for being great. We will see you all on Monday. Until then, have a lovely weekend and God bless you all. Thank you and see you soon. Bye-bye.
There is only one Quran, right? Every Quran in the world is the same. That's what you've been told. You have been told a lie!
26 of the Quran.
26 different Quran!
There are 0 Dawa guys apparently left on the planet who are willing to defend Muhammad in a debate.
Everybody can go and read it. This is a book full of mistakes in Arabic, in the grammar, in the spelling, in the pronunciation.
Whoever wrote the Quran made an error because they didn't quite understand what was written in the 7th century in the Torah and the Injil.
As promised, I will give you more than 20 reasons why I left Islam in this video.
We know that stories about Muhammad were made up on an industrial scale.
What in the world is this Injil?